Live Alive for Nintendo Switch offers an unconventional take on the JRPG genre, experimenting with different time periods, varied stories, and game mechanics. There's a lot to enjoy here, and I think many players would like this game. However, it just didn't do it for me. There's a lot of variety in the settings, stories, and mechanics, but with so much experimentation, things don't always get the room they need to be developed. The end result can be hit or miss, and is a little disappointing. While its oddball approach might be great for some, it just didn't do it for me. So, without further ado, let's take a look at Live Alive HD-2D Remake for Nintendo Switch. There will be spoilers. In the 1990s, the Super Nintendo Entertainment System ushered in a golden age for a lot of game developers. Squaresoft was one of the standouts of this period. With heavy hitters like Final Fantasy, the company was already well established, and its RPG output for the Super Nintendo would be prolific. But outside of Japan, the JRPG genre was still incredibly niche. Nintendo didn't release their RPGs such as Mother outside of Japan. Even with third-party games like Dragon Warrior, and with Sega bringing their games like Phantasy Star to the West, as a whole, the genre was still pretty obscure to Westerners at the time, and many JRPGs were doomed to be Japanese exclusives. On September 2nd, 1994, Squaresoft released Live Alive in Japan. This game was very unusual in its approach to many aspects of the genre and garnered cult classic status, and players in the West were still able to unofficially enjoy the game through fan translations. Years later, Square Enix decided to revisit it and remake it in the HD-2D style, and this time it released worldwide. This remake released for Nintendo Switch on July 22, 2022, and for PS4, PS5, and PC on April 27, 2023. Live Alive is structured with individual, unconnected chapters that can be played in any order. Chapters are set in different time periods, dabbling in different genres of stories and messing with game mechanics in order to keep things fresh. Basically, it's an anthology of short stories, but in JRPG form. A comedic adventure of a caveman saving his girlfriend in the prehistoric era. A kung fu master looking for a successor in Imperial China. A shinobi trying to save a VIP in Edo, Japan. A man with no name trying to protect a town from outlaws in the Wild West. A fighter trying to become the world's strongest by beating the world's strongest in the modern day. A mind-reading delinquent's misadventures in near-future Japan. And a robot traveling with space truckers on a freighter in the distant future. At the end of each chapter, there's a boss fight with one of a variety of cool monsters. After beating the initial handful of chapters, a new one unlocks. Set in the Middle Ages, a fantasy hero named Oersted goes on a vaguely Dragon Quest-esque adventure, but it's a little different. We'll get into that later. After that, the final chapter opens up, where the other heroes get to cross over for a big finale that brings everything together. Now that we have context, let's look at content. Live Alive features a total of 9 chapters, varying a lot in terms of length, story, design, and mechanics. Until the Middle Ages chapter, they don't appear to be connected. All of them include combat to some degree, and since that's what you're going to spend most of your time with, let's look at that first. I'd describe this combat system as Tactics Light. Combat takes place on a grid, and different moves have different ranges or AoEs that they can affect. Each character has a gauge that shows when they can act, and it'll fill up as you move around or perform actions. Unlike Square's Final Fantasy games of this period, it's not using the active time battle system, so you can sit there for as long as you need to plan things out. Some moves have charge-up times, leaving a character sitting still until it's finally done, but some moves can knock a character back, and when that happens, any charging move will be cancelled. There are different types of damage, and characters might be vulnerable or resistant to different types of damage. There are also some status ailments that can be inflicted. I wish there was more to the damage types than this type hurts this enemy a bunch or whatever, but that's just me being spoiled by systems like Press Turn and not anything wrong with this game. On the whole, the combat is pretty simple. Characters have HP, and you have a basic equipment system and some items, but ultimately there's just not much to it. There's no money and no shops. Each fight is treated as its own thing. There's no MP to manage for using your moves, and even if there was, your party will heal up to full after every combat. You only ever have to manage one fight at a time. One of my favorite things in RPGs is resource management, and it's not really here except for maybe managing your healing items. There's only really a couple of dungeons in the game, so there's not really that much tension or tactical thought that goes into the game other than using the attack with big numbers until you win, or running away from an annoying fight. If you want something really simple, you might enjoy this. I found myself wanting more, and not really in a good way. I called the grid system Tactics Light because aside from accounting for range, there's just nothing to it. You don't have the ability to hide behind cover or interact with environments or anything like that. Well, I guess AoE attacks can make poison or fire tiles and stuff like that, but that's really about it. At first, I thought it was a neat change of pace from normal RPG combat, where, your characters just sit and stare at each other and take turns politely. But after a while, it's obvious that Live Alive is not really going anywhere with it. I like the idea of adding a grid to an RPG without having to turn the game into Gladius or something, but it just doesn't really add anything in the end here. The grid is just a novelty, and it gets old. There's also an encounter setup where you face a group of weaker enemies with a leader, and if you can kill the leader, it will instantly end the encounter. Not a bad idea, but they run it into the ground. A lot of battles in the near future chapter and the dungeon from the Dominion of Hate are set up like this, and it just gets repetitive. Basically, I like the ideas that the combat system is trying to introduce, but I wish the execution was better. Since most of the game is a collection of non-linear short stories, they probably couldn't really flesh this out because they have no idea what order you're going to play this stuff in. How do you develop a satisfying system that starts simple to learn and develops difficulty and complexity in a satisfying way when you can't even determine what order the stuff's going to be played in? In that regard, maybe the bite-sized chapter thing is a blessing and a curse for the combat system. Moving on. This game's soundtrack is incredible. Square has a great track record of having absolute bangers in their games, and this game is no exception. Some of my favorites are the music from the Wild West, the China battle theme, and especially the prehistory battle theme. Kiss of Jealousy is one of my favorite battle songs I've heard in a Square game, and that's saying a lot. It probably helps that they didn't use it for the whole game, though. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention the boss theme. So, you've probably heard Megalovania from Undertale. Well, Toby Fox was inspired by this game's boss fight song, Megalomania. And can you blame him? It's an incredible boss theme. It never gets old, and it's always a delight to hear. It always helps make the boss fight feel like a big deal. With so many chapters and so many different settings, the soundtrack is able to take advantage of it to stretch its wings and soar into greatness. Now, let's talk about the stories. Each chapter tells its own story, and in doing so, Live Alive is able to dip its toes into a bunch of different genres. The prehistory chapter is pretty lighthearted. A caveman named Pogo and his friend Gory get into some trouble. Pogo hides a girl named Baru that another tribe meant to sacrifice to their dinosaur god, Odo. Odio? And they end up getting exiled for a time. The day is saved when they defeat the dinosaur god and live happily ever after. This one's pretty silly. This is apparently before language was invented, so all the characters just have these little thought bubbles whenever they talk. The whole non-verbal caveman comedy thing makes me think of SpongeBob before comedy. It's not bad, but it's limited by the lack of dialogue to flesh things out. After a point, it just kinda got old, but the gameplay was fun. In Imperial China, the Earthen Heart Shifu is a martial arts master looking for a successor, recruiting a bandit, a gluttonous lad, and a coward with a good heart. He trains them, and this plays out with you sparring in a series of one-on-one battles to level up your students. Depending on how you do this, you might end up with a different student as your new master. At one point, an enemy group from a rival school, led by this chapter's bad guy, attacks a town, and Shifu goes to save the day, refusing to let his students come because violence begets violence. When he returns, his school was attacked by the opposing school, and only one of his students survived. It's up to them to go together to fight against the enemy school, and after a series of boss fights, his successor saves the day by defeating the rival master and becoming the new Earthen Heart Shifu. I really liked this story. It has a turtle school versus crane school vibe, and I enjoyed getting to teach these students. They actually managed to make me care a lot about them, even though they were only here for a little bit. So that's pretty good. Next is the Twilight of Edo, Japan. Inexperienced ninja Aboromaru has to infiltrate an enemy clan's fortress, rescue a VIP, and kill their captor. This one offers a lot of variety. You can use stealth, play like a normal dungeon, or kill literally everything. And you'll get different endings for killing nobody or killing everybody. This is where Undertale got the pacifist and genocide run from. Interesting story, but I don't want to be a ninja or play a stealth game in a JRPG. I didn't really enjoy mixing the genres. I found that it was kind of unsatisfying. I also didn't like using Aboromaru's moves in battle. Then again, he's a ninja, he's not supposed to be fighting. This isn't Yojimbo. If you like ninjas, you might like this. In the Wild West, the Sundown Kid fights off a bounty hunter named Mad Dog and goes to the town of Success. But the town is about to be attacked by outlaws led by the bad guy of this story. So, Mad Dog and the townsfolk team up with the kid to set up traps and fight off the bad guys, before finally, the kid and Mad Dog settle things. And at the end, the Sundown Kid rides off into the sunset. This whole thing reminds me of Good Springs, but as a JRPG. I really like this one. This is one of the shortest chapters, which really disappoints me because I love westerns and I would totally dig a JRPG western. Well, I guess there's always Wild Arms. The modern day chapter goes light on the story. A fighter challenges various martial arts masters to become the world's strongest and learn their techniques. Another fighter who is the bad guy here also does this, but after beating them he kills all of them, and is planning on killing the hero as well. But of course, the hero saves the day. This is basically set up like a fighting game arcade mode, but you get to pick what order to play it in. It's simple, but effective. It's not too deep, but it's cool how your character learns moves when enemies use them on you. It's like being a blue mage, except I don't hate it. The near future has a mind-reading delinquent named Akira fight thugs to avenge his dad, ending up piloting a giant mech and stopping a big conspiracy. It's basically an over-the-top 90s mecha anime. The story's fun, but the gameplay got really repetitive here. Lots of those kill the leader to end the battle early type fights. I guess I've been spoiled by games like Persona, because when this game was originally made, urban anime JRPGs weren't really much of a thing outside of classic Megaten. It's a good idea, but it didn't really do it for me in execution. The gameplay felt repetitive, and I don't really care that much about Akira's tragic past since the chapter comes and goes so fast. The Distant Future. It's basically Alien if it was a JRPG visual novel about a robot named Cube. Space truckers on the Cogito Ergo Sum are hauling a rare alien creature across space. Except it's not a horror movie. You don't get to fight anything until the very end. It's all about the story. It feels a lot like the original Alien, with similar story beats and the same sort of thrown into the deep end and left to figure it out as the movie goes on, New Hollywood type of writing vibe. If you know, you know. Do you like Alien? I do, and I like this. Not much in the gameplay department, though. It's a visual novel through and through. An interesting choice for a JRPG, not that exciting to play, but I did appreciate the Alien homage. The Middle Ages are something else. It starts off with a Dragon Quest plot. Oersted is a fantasy hero. Save the princess, talk to some old dudes, defeat the big bad evil guy. Wait, we're not playing D&D? This is still Live Alive? Things get crazy. Oersted ends up being tricked by an illusion into killing the king, and ends up all alone. His friend Strabo is no friend at all, doing evil deeds and letting the princess blame Oersted for them. In the end, Strabo is beaten, the princess takes her own life, and Oersted is left broken and alone. With nothing to live for, he turns heel and becomes the new big bad evil guy. There's a lot going on in this scenario, and I think it's a bit of a mess. You've got a whole JRPG plot crammed into just a few short hours, along with a weird Shakespearean English script and a rather generic fantasy setting. Now, this might surprise you, but just because I like JRPGs doesn't mean I'm in love with fantasy, and this is a textbook fantasy JRPG plot, just with some twists here and there. This is a preference thing, not anything this game did wrong. I'm just not that excited about fantasy settings, and I don't really care about these characters. Oersted is important because of the next chapter, but the rest of these people are basically just footnotes in a larger text. This plot would be good as a longer story fleshed out in a full game, but here I think it's just too much too fast. But your mileage may vary. Finally, with the Dominion of Hate, you can pick one of the previous heroes. Your chosen hero and the others are brought to the place that the Middle Ages chapter took place in, and you gather them together to fight against Oersted and save the day. But in the end, the evils of man will always be a threat, and the danger of the Dark Lord returning will always be a real problem. Overall, I like the ideas of this game's various storylines, but I wish that they could have been fleshed out in a longer format. I find it hard to get invested in drama involving characters that are only going to be here for a couple of hours. It's tough for me to stay invested in all this, whereas I think a longer plot that is built up for an entire game is more my speed. I suppose Live Alive has helped me learn a little bit about my preferences, because I feel like I better understand what I want out of an RPG. So with that, now it's time for the wrap-up. Live Alive on the Super Famicom was a cult classic with a unique identity and appeal. And even in the West, it had a lot of fans despite never having an official release. It was to the point that Square Enix saw fit to bring the game back for the modern era using HD-2D graphics, and they released it worldwide. There's a lot of cool ideas in the game, and I can see the appeal of these ideas, but the game ultimately just doesn't scratch that itch for me. There's so much variety here that Live Alive is able to cast a wide net, so to speak, but my issue is that I like the ideas but the game doesn't develop them. Because of constantly changing things up, Live Alive feels like a game with the width of a river and the depth of a mud puddle. However, I want to emphasize I can see the appeal here. Square Enix tends to have long, epic, sprawling RPGs like Final Fantasy, so needless to say, a short story anthology is not really what I was expecting. What I'm trying to say is, something like this might be really appealing to a lot of people, with more shorter, concise stories and much shorter runtime than a lot of JRPGs. Basically, I concede that ultimately, my gripes with this game are bias and preferences to what a JRPG should be. Live Alive just wasn't for me. That doesn't mean it's a bad game, it's a game that wasn't for me. Lots of people love it, but it's not my thing. If the game sounds cool, I recommend you check it out. If it doesn't sound like something you would enjoy, I don't recommend you check it out. But in the end, either way, that's just my opinion. If you have any thoughts on Live Alive, love it or hate it, I'd love to talk about it in the comments down below. Thanks for watching.